The overriding motivation for the subsequent series of safety compromises, an obsession on the part of the master to reach the port of Tauranga by 3 a.m. Wow. As a maritime safety analyst, I've got to say, reading that quote always gives me chills. Because, you see, the MV Rena disaster, which is still New Zealand's absolute worst maritime environmental crisis, well, it didn't start with a freak storm. It didn't start with some unpredictable engine failure. No, it literally started with a clock. A completely self-imposed, unrealistic deadline that kicked off a devastating chain reaction of human errors. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a comprehensive case study, completely deconstructing this systemic failure. We're going to look at it through what safety experts like to call the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. Imagine multiple layers of defense, from the guys on the bridge all the way up to the corporate boardroom. Now, imagine each layer has holes in it. When those holes just happen to line up perfectly, boom, disaster strikes. Okay, let's just quickly glance at our agenda for today's briefing. We've got 1. Anatomy of a disaster. 2. The drift into failure. 3. Organizational tolerance for risk. 4. A system unprepared. 5. The toxic brew. And finally, 6. Morizasa and cultural impact. Section 1. Anatomy of a disaster. The context. To give you an idea of the sheer scale we're dealing with, the MV Rena was an absolute beast of a ship. We're talking a 236-meter container ship. On the night in question, she was carrying over 1,300 containers and a staggering 1,733 tons of heavy fuel oil. Now, she grounded on the Astrolabe Reef on October 5th, 2011. And here's the crazy part. The weather that night? Completely calm. Clear skies, great visibility, which tells us something absolutely crucial right off the bat. This grounding was a purely human and systemic failure. Mother Nature had literally zero to do with it. Section 2. The drift into failure, a sequence of navigational errors. Let's walk through this timeline together, because it perfectly maps out how the crew slowly, almost casually drifted into disaster. On the morning of October 4th, the master sets this totally unrealistic 3 a.m. arrival time just to catch a tidal window. That creates massive production pressure on the crew. Fast forward to that night, the second officer starts making these unplotted little tweaks to the autopilot to try and save some distance. But he completely forgets to account for leeway, the sideways drift of the ship caused by wind and currents. Then, at 2:04 a.m., a radar echo of the actual reef pops up on the screen. But the master, he just assumes it's a false echo because he doesn't see a ship out the window and dismisses it. 10 minutes later, during a routine shift change, the bridge is essentially left totally unmonitored. And at 2:14 a.m., the MV Rena slams into the reef at 17 knots, full cruising speed. Now, the really important takeaway here is that tossing out the passage plan wasn't just a freak one-time mistake. It was a classic case of what we call the normalization of deviance. That's when breaking fundamental safety rules just kind of becomes the standard way of doing things. It's like if you start speeding just a tiny bit on your daily commute, and before you know it, going 15 over the limit feels completely normal. On that bridge, the culture of poor navigational discipline had gotten so bad that it entirely overrode standard bridge resource management. No one was double-checking anything. Section 3. Organizational tolerance for risk, CIL ship management. But look, we can't just point fingers at the guys on the bridge. The ship's management company, CL Ship Management, was sitting back and actively tolerating some massive systemic risks. They had terribly inadequate oversight of their own safety management system. I mean, in the months leading up to the crash, they literally ignored clear warnings from prior port state control inspections that had flagged a bunch of deficiencies. Their safety culture was basically paper-only compliance. Add to that some international gaps in verifying the training standards for the ship's Filipino crew, and well, you've got the perfect recipe for disaster. Management created an environment where one master's personal obsession with arriving on time wasn't challenged. It was allowed to become lethal. Section 4. A system unprepared. The MNZ response. The official review called what happened next a cold start disaster. Maritime New Zealand, or MNZ, did have a national Tier 3 response framework in place, but it was super rigid and historically under-resourced. It was really designed for your standard run-of-the-mill oil spill. It was absolutely not built to handle the unbelievable scale, the speed, and the sheer complexity of a massive wreck recovery, especially with the entire country's media watching their every move. So MNZ essentially had to throw the playbook out the window and adapt on the fly. They realized their standard rigid command structure just wasn't cutting it. They had to dynamically restructure towards a unified whole-of-government command. They even brought in a director's representative specifically to handle the high-level strategy and talk to stakeholders, which was a brilliant move because it finally freed up the tactical commanders to actually focus on dealing with the ship and the spill. Section 5. The Toxic Brew. Redefining the oil spill. It's really important to understand that this wasn't just a simple oil spill. This was a multi-pollutant assault on the ecosystem. Yes, you had about 350 tons of heavy fuel oil leaking out, which tragically caused the acute mortality of over 2,000 seabirds. But consider the rest of the cargo. Between 300 and 400 containers fell overboard, dumping millions of little plastic beads called nurdles, which are a nightmare of physical pollution. Inside the wreck itself, there's still 7 to 12 tons of granulated copper, messing with the local marine life. Oh, and tributyltin, or TBT, leaching right off the ship's anti-fouling paint, which is a known hormone disruptor. This was a highly toxic, persistent cocktail of chemicals and heavy metals. Because of all these different pollutants, we actually saw two completely different recovery narratives play out. On land, you had this incredibly resilient coastline. The beaches were rapidly cleaned up and essentially bounced back within a matter of months. But underwater, a totally different story. The reef right at the wreck site is chronically contaminated. It's dealing with ongoing point-source toxicity that is permanently altering the benthic marine communities down there. So you have visibly clean beaches on the surface, but a permanently scarred world underneath. But let's talk about those beaches for a second, because the cleanup effort was nothing short of unprecedented. Get this, over 8,000 registered volunteers showed up, pouring more than 24,000 hours into scrubbing the coastline by hand. And that hands and knees effort was about so much more than just removing oil. It really brought the community together, giving the broader public in the Bay of Plenty a profound sense of empowerment, agency, and eventually closure. Section 6. Maori and Cultural Impact. To truly grasp the human side of this technical failure, we really have to look at it through the eyes of the Tangata Whenua, the local indigenous Maori people. For them, the ocean and the reef aren't just natural resources. They are a tanga, an ancestral treasure. So when local children see their beach lined with bags of toxic sludge, you realize this wasn't just a technical accident. It was a deeply personal, profound spiritual violation. Which brings us to a really beautiful central concept in the Maori worldview called Maori. Maori is defined as the spiritual well-being or the life essence of the environment, and it exists entirely independent of us humans. All that twisted steel and leaking heavy metal absolutely shattered the reef's Maori, and that is exactly why there has been intense, ongoing pushback from Maori groups against abandoning the wreck on the seabed. For them, leaving it there is like an open wound that prevents any true spiritual healing. And that leaves us with a massive, lingering question to chew on. Because as long as we're demanding next-day delivery on goods from across the globe, that clock is going to keep ticking. How does the global maritime industry actually balance the intense, relentless pressure for commercial speed with the absolute imperative to protect the Maori, the life essence of our most vulnerable ecosystems? The MV Rena is a stark reminder of exactly what happens when that balance completely falls apart. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.